pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker, Danielle Citron. Danielle Citron is a professor at the University of Virginia, where she writes and teaches about privacy, free expression, and civil rights. Her scholarship and advocacy have been recognized nationally and internationally. In 2019, Citron was named a MacArthur Fellow based on her cyber stalking and intimate privacy work. In 2018, she received the University of Maryland Baltimore Champions of Excellence Award. And in 2015, the United Kingdom's Prospect magazine named her one of the top 50 world thinkers. And the Daily Record named her one of the top 50 most influential Marylanders. I'm sure Maryland is sad to have lost her to Virginia. She serves as the inaugural director of the school's Law Tech Center, which focuses on pressing questions in law technology. Her second and latest book, The Fight for Privacy, Protecting Dignity, Identity, and Love in the Digital Age, was released in October 2022. And if your library doesn't already have this book in your collection, I encourage you to purchase it. Please welcome our keynote speaker, Danielle Citron.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really a delight. I feel like there's no question that librarians and privacy professionals are best friends. You are our guardians at the gate. So it's wonderful to be here to talk to you about my book, The Fight for Privacy. So what I'm going to do is, I'm just going to zoom out for a second to explain that what I'm going to do in my talk today is describe the concept of intimate privacy, which is the privacy that we afford, our body, our health, our, innermost thoughts, which we share all day long. We text, we search, we read, we browse, right? We communicate with other people. The privacy that's afforded our sexual activities, our sexual orientation, our gender identity, and our close relationships. I'm going to explain sort of when it's implicated, why it's important, how it can be exploited and violated by individuals, companies, and governments. And I'm a law professor, so and an advocate as well. And so what I'm going to do is kind of articulate the theory of intimate privacy as a civil right, and how we need to, how thinking about it that way in the law can be helpful for some solutions going forward. But of course, law cannot do it all. So I'm going to give you a sense of like what companies do. I do a lot of work with companies over the last 15 years on trust and safety. And I know I'm going to tell a depressing story, like, frankly, but I think what we'll do is end with a little bit of hope, talk about my work with the South Korean government. And then maybe I'd love some questions. So maybe we can also talk more in the Q&A about some of my work with the Attorney General then of California, Kamala Harris, and some small improvements we made with companies when she was AG. So intimate privacy, all day long, we expect, we want, and we deserve intimate privacy. But so often, it's not ours and we don't know it. So, every day, all day long, we go into locker rooms, public bathrooms, and we assume and we expect that no one is recording us and then streaming all of that information to the cloud. We, of course, communicate, text, email, our deepest thoughts, sometimes really like everyday boring stuff. Sometimes we share information like our health conditions, the doctors we're going to. Sometimes we share intimate information like nude photos with people we care about. And all the while we're assuming and we believe that the other person is going to keep our confidences and that the company's sort of securing and sending and storing that data is going to keep it confidential. And of course, I do not have an Apple phone, but, we have our health, devices, whether it's, on our wrists, on our rings, we, talk to our Amazon Echoes in our houses, our personal, digital devices, our Siris. We, search, we browse, we use our apps on our phone, and that includes dating apps, period tracking, and other kind of health apps. And all the while we are sharing some of those intimate details of our lives, like what we're reading, what we're thinking about, our health conditions, our temperatures, for women recording, when they got their periods, when they didn't get their periods, what they're buying at pharmacies. And we're doing all of that all the while. The companies are saying to us, whether it's social media, it's dating apps, it's mobile, it's health apps, it's our pharmacies, we go to a hospital's website. And all the while, the message we're getting as individuals is that all this stuff is good for us. We're going to learn a lot. We're going to be enlightened. We're going to get more control over our bodies and ourselves and our thoughts. And it's good for us, right? We are not told, at least explicitly, and not in any conscious way, that all the information that is being collected about us, that is being tracked, is not only being collected by advertisers, not only by, of course, the services we're connecting with, but by strangers, by advertisers, marketers, and in turn then sold to data brokers. And then in turn, data brokers' biggest clients are law enforcement. So we're doing all of that. We're assuming this is all good for us, right? That it's making our lives better. And it is. I'm no technophobe. But unfortunately, especially in the United States, as we are doing that, the finest granular details of our intimate lives are being collected, stored, shared with what we call as third parties. That seems so antiseptic, but it's advertisers, it's marketers, it's data brokers, and ultimately it can be law enforcement purchasing it. Okay, so let me just like set the stage, and this is going to feel, I think, both abstract and visceral at the same time, but like why it is that we care about intimate privacy. And then what I'm going to do is, like, as I always, like in my work, I interviewed for my book about 65 to 70 people from the United States, UK, Iceland, Ireland, India, and Australia, like, so folks from, and Israel, folks from around the globe, about individual privacy violations. So I'm going to tell you about someone from the United States and then kind of widen the aperture, but telling you like human stories so we can appreciate this. But first, like, why does intimate privacy matter? Right? You know, this will feel, it's just, I think this really makes sense, but like our first relationships of how we figure out who we are is with our bodies. It's our first relation. It's like how we experience pain and suffering, how we experience like the development of the self is through the body. And we end up carving out, like, throughout our lives, invisible space around our bodies and our innermost thoughts. And it's not just that we're alone. Privacy is we, it's not a me, right? When we carve out that invisible space with people we trust, and sometimes and often with technologies that accompany us with our bodies, we can figure out who we are, not only today, but, you know, ultimately who we want to be, the kind of identities we see for ourselves. In Janet Monk's first book, she's a trans writer and activist, you know, she Becoming Realness, she wrote about, like, she's at, I think, 4th grade, and she and her best friend, her mom and brother are out, you know, doing some errands, and she and her best friend went into mom's closet and tried on clothing. And she said, like, it's in those moments with her best friend, who she knew would keep her confidences, that she kind of she figured out who she was. And it was that kind of these moments, and in the, you know, of confidentiality, that she could say, all right, I'm going to tell my mom and my brother who I am, and I can figure out who I am. So self-development and identity development and intimate privacy run together. It's indispensable. You could say that intimate privacy is a precondition to figuring out who we are. And then connected to, like, self-development is human dignity. And I'm going to use that word dignity really in a very specific way to refer to personal integrity. That is our self-esteem and our social esteem. So, you know, when we can decide who has access to our innermost thoughts, our bodies, our health, you know, our communications, our reading, when we can figure that who that is and who has access to it and who doesn't, we can see ourselves as like being in charge of our intimate lives, right? Our self-esteem is such that, like, we're the deciders. And when we can be seen as fully integrated people, we can enjoy social esteem. So Sartre in Being in Nothingness talks about, this is, I think, a really perfect way to help explain the concept of social esteem and intimate privacy, is he gives 2 examples, one which is of the concept of being ashamed, and the other is the concept of pure shame. And he says, think about the peeping Tom who is peering into a keyhole at someone, and presumably in the text, he seems to be talking about a woman, and that the peeping Tom is a man. And he says, there's a moment when the peeping Tom thinks he's being caught, when he hears a creak on the stairs. And it's in that moment the face turns red, and the person feels ashamed of violating someone else's intimate privacy, right? Of spying on someone. And Sartre explains, being ashamed is fundamentally different from the concept of what he calls pure shame, which he explains is, when someone strips us of our clothing without our permission, it's in that moment of pure shame that we see ourselves not as subjects, but as objects, seeing through other people's eyes, that they see us as just a body, as just body parts, as just a fragment of ourselves. And that concept is really crucial to intimate privacy violations. That is, when someone's nude photo is posted online without their permission, when they're taped in the bathroom, like a public bathroom, and it's streamed online. So many victims for victim, will explain to me that they feel like they can never unsee how other people see them, that they are just objects. They're just a vagina, they're just genitals to other people. And it's a consciousness of their social esteem. They experience that kind of thing that's called pure shame, right? Which is, they're not embarrassed, but they feel a sense of vulnerability, right? Of being an object and not being a subject. And sort of tied to, of course, like these two concepts of dignity and self-development or identity are interpersonal in a sense, of course, because privacy is us and companies. It's not, just alone. But privacy is also a precondition to love, right? How we form relationships by, it takes time. And it like an onion, this is from social psychologists, explain that, we get to know other people by becoming reciprocally vulnerable, right? Like, we're going to share our innermost selves and they're going to share theirs, and it's going to happen over time. And it's only on the basis of trust, that we trust them to treat our intimate information as we hope, right? Rather than as we fear. So Charles Fried, I have to say, in the book called The Anatomy of Value, said it best when he said, privacy is the oxygen for love. So in all these ways, intimate privacy matters, right? It matters for our figuring out who we are, and over time, iteratively, for how we see ourselves and others see us as whole people, and to form relationships that are at the heart of being a human being, right? And it's not just love relationships that is, intimate and, ones that involve sex, but all kinds of close relationships and friendships. So let me share an experience I think is particularly apt after the Dobbs decision, which where the Supreme Court found that people are capable of pregnancy do not enjoy a constitutional right to reproductive privacy. I'm going to give an example that I think will speak not only to kind of the moment that we're in. And before I wrote the book, Dobbs had not come down. So it's, I think, an important moment to kind of take stock of intimate privacy in a post-Dobbs world. So a woman who I interviewed for the book, who's from the United States, I'm going to call her Carly. She was in a relationship with someone for about a year, and the person got increasingly possessive and a little bit frightening. And so she broke off the relationship. And after they broke up, she found that wherever she went, her ex was. Like, he would show up at the gym, not just at her workplace, which she knew, but a friend's house or restaurant, like he would be there. And after a couple of weeks of like being trailed by him and her not responding to him or acknowledging him, he sent her a text message. And with the text message was a nude photo of her, one that she had never shared with him, one that was on her phone, that a former boyfriend from about 9 years ago had taken of her. It was a lovely moment. And she kept it for sentimental reasons. She had never shared it with her ex. And he sent it to her. And he said, I'm going to share this with the world. I'm going to share this with your bosses. She was a nurse. I'm going to share this with your manager and your coworkers. I'm going to post this online unless you get back together with me. And she didn't give in to his threats, and he made good on them. He posted them on non-consensual intimate imagery sites that are like a dime a dozen. And I'll explain how many there are. He posted it on Twitter. And he created an impersonation account in her name on Facebook and was friending her friends, and then included the nude photo on the Facebook page. He emailed her manager, her boss at the hospital, and some of her colleagues. And he wrote it as if the email to those folks, as if it came from her, right? Like, see me in my natural state, like, enjoy. And, you might say, like, how did he get a hold of that? information. Well, our deepest suspicion is that, he had planted what we call stalkerware or spyware on a spyware app on her phone. So what, you just need access to someone's phone. In about 2 minutes, you can install it. So long as you have either their password or their phone is not password protected, you can install an app on their phone, which runs secretly. You don't know it's there. And for about $29.99 a month, someone can track everything that you do with your phone. So all of your photos, your calendar, your texts, your emails, you can turn someone's phone with stalkerware into a microphone that can then hear 15 feet around the phone. And so her acts obtained, of course, the photo, but also everything that she was emailing with her friends and texting and her location. The spyware then recounts and shows like in real time where you're going. So, it was not only jarring and terrifying because she threw out her phone. She went to law enforcement. Law enforcement was like, sorry, we can't help you. And she got rid of her phone and got a new one. But as she said to me, she was like, how do I trust that he hasn't figured out a way, to get spyware on my new phone? So it makes you feel total unease and a lack of security. And like so many victims, she explained that she felt like everyone just saw her in that photo. That is, from now on, whoever her closest friends who, got notice of the photo, strangers, right, on all these sites. She said, I can't unsee the fact that other people see me that way, right? Sartre's kind of concept of pure shame. And she worried about her job, like she had a job, but it was, she knew that others could find these photos and that her colleagues had seen them. And it just was something that she felt like it invaded kind of her soul. It was like an incurable disease, as she described it. So that's Carly's experience, right? And this happens in 2018 is when I interview her. Now, let's imagine if this happens post Dobbs, right? So imagine that her ex obtains and sees and watches in real time her text messages with her friends that say that she was pregnant and she was considering, terminating the pregnancy, and that she, was thinking about that. So, this isn't a fanciful hypothetical. A man from Texas recently filed a lawsuit against his ex-girlfriend's 3 closest friends for wrongful death. And he got a hold of her text messages. There were, in the complaint, he embedded photos of the woman's phone with his finger, like you could see his finger in it. So he had gotten access to her phone, physical access to her phone. And her friends had helped her obtain abortion medicine. And they lived in Dallas and they had commuted to Houston to buy the medicine and then gotten it to the woman. And the woman in the text messages says, like, one of her friends who's being sued for wrongful death, and this is in Texas, so they have a bounty law and a fetal heart bill. One of the friends says, like, be really careful with your phone so your ex doesn't see it, because you can imagine what he could do with it. Now, they kind of were prescient. So the man sued not the woman, but her friends for helping her, aiding and abetting an abortion in Texas. Right. So it's not a kind of fanciful possibility that this sort of thing can happen. The invasions of intimate privacy is going to lead to lawsuits. It's going to lead to the criminalization of women, depending on which state, as well as, of course, health providers. Okay, so that's the kind of individual story of a potential violator of intimate privacy. And, the question of like all those sites that were hosting the photos of Carly, there are, just to kind of let you understand the landscape, there are over 9,500 sites that host non-consensual intimate imagery. Some are devoted to the practice. They have the most uncreative names like Hidden Cam, Hidden Camera, Mr. Deepfakes, so that they are explicitly about non-IB, explicitly about non-consensual intimate imagery. And they're mostly, 98% of them have photos of women or gay men. And so there are sites devoted to gay, bi, trans men that are explicit, that post people's Grindr's handles, right? That people often say, like, they'll approve of posting of men's intimate images, and they say things like, where does he live? Where does he work? And they have them sort of by locality where you live. So it's quite dangerous. So those are and mostly are hosted in the United States, because we afford those sites immunity from responsibility. So we'll talk about this when we explain why law fails. Okay, so the kind of the surveillance of intimate life that individuals engage in and that websites, facilitate and solicit, in the United States, our surveillance economy, the collection of intimate life, of information about intimate life, is a feature, right? It's not a bug as it might be somewhere else, right? In the United States, we have permission, that is apps, our browsers, our search engines, our Alexa Echo, our Amazon Echoes, our health devices. They have permission as a default matter to collect any and all information about our daily lives. And unless they lie to us, right? Unless they sort of break the promises that they've made in their privacy policies, then it's all good, right? The default is you can collect, you can share, you can monetize, you can sell, and often keep it for yourself because the idea is you're going to use it for some other business model someday, right? You're going to be able to monetize it at some point. And much of this information is tied to people's mobile ID, device IDs, which is our names functionally. So it's not anonymized in any meaningful way, this information. So I'm going to give an example of the surveillance economy that relates to intimate life, just to show you how unexpected the collection of intimate data is and how it can be weaponized. Is Jeffrey Burrell was a Monsignor who was an administrator for the U.S. Catholic bishops, and he didn't have a parish. He was an administrator. And he used Grindr, and both in his town and then when he would travel. And he got a message from a reporter from a U.S., a Catholic, news website called The Pillar. And the person said, I have all of your geolocation information. I know that you go to gay bars, and I'm going to write a story about it. And the reporter, at the time, it was believed that the reporter told his bosses, and he lost his job, or he resigns, but it's under pressure, but he knows he's going to be fired. At the time, so when the story broke 2 years ago, it was unclear that, as we know, the reporter didn't follow the person, and the reporter explained that the information was gathered from data brokers. There are 40 brokers, data brokers, whose raison d'etre is the collection of geolocation information. And at the time, the thinking was that the reporter had bought the information. But 2 months ago, the Washington Post broke the story that it wasn't the reporter, but rather a Catholic group in Colorado that had spent $5 million buying from every single location data broker, all of the geolocation information for months and months and months. And the idea was to out gay priests. So that Burrell was just one of many. And that information then is leaked, one's geolocation information from your phone to your app to then data brokers, and which led to the connecting of Jeffrey Burrell to going to, gay bars. Our geolocation information is some of the most sensitive information. It's who we sleep with, who we love, where we go, our churches, our mosque, our political affiliations. We tell the story of our intimate lives where we go. So just after Dobbs breaks, just to kind of circle back to where we are, just after Dobbs, the decision comes down, Vice News, some of the greatest tech journalists are at Motherboard, which is part of Vice. They bought for $160 from one data broker, SafeGraph, information that was tagged with everyone who walked in and out of, for a week, Planned Parenthoods across the United States. There were, at the time, over 700 Planned Parenthoods in the United States. That number is increasingly, that's falling in light of Dobbs. But it was for $160. You can get the mobile ID device of every person within a certain number of feet going into and out of Planned Parenthoods. We can imagine how that could be weaponized. There was a website that was set up called prolifewhistleblower.com by a pro-life group in Texas. It's been since taken down, and I think it's because GoDaddy kind of refused to host it. And the group has explained that it's trying to look for, a host that's going to be willing to host the site. It hasn't come back yet. I'm hopeful it won't. But we know from the late 1990s, there was a website called the Nuremberg Files. And Neil Horsley was a pro-life advocate who would list the names of abortion providers across the United States. There were 200 doctors whose personal addresses, so doxing, personal addresses and telephone numbers were included on the website. And every time an abortion provider was killed, the person's name would be crossed out. When the doctor was wounded, the doctor's name would be then shaded in gray. And anyone who hadn't been hurt or wounded just appeared in regular print. Now, because Horsley had provided that information himself, he was the information content provider. He was responsible and he was able to be sued under a federal law. But the site that I told you about that has come down, if someone else's, if it's user-generated content that people are posting to these sites, for example, so-and-so got an abortion or so-and-so helped someone get an abortion, if the site operator themselves under Section 230 of the Federal Communications Decency Act would mean that they're not responsible. And maybe in the Q&A, we can talk a bit about how governments have across the globe, including the United States, have weaponized intimate information. But thought, because it's like 1:28, I thought I would kind of move on and explain how we should think about intimate privacy, like given the risks and the importance of intimate privacy, how law should address it, how companies have sort of in fits and starts have been, but how we can nudge them. And then I'll kind of conclude with a little bit of hope. So at the heart of my book is an argument that intimate privacy is a moral right, that it's a human and foundational fundamental right, and it is also a civil right. And so we use that concept in the United States of a civil right. What we have long meant, the kind of the origin story of civil rights, like the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and theorists have explained that when we say something is a civil right, we say that it's a right that matters, that each and every one of us enjoys, but also one that is very vulnerable to discrimination. And what we say is you can't give it away, you can't trade away civil rights without a really good reason, right? Like efficiency, profits, makes things easy. Boys will be boys, too bad, so sad, I'm kind of enjoying it. Those aren't good enough reasons. When we have a moral and a civil right that's at stake, that law needs to protect it. And so the modern civil rights laws, I think, provide a really interesting roadmap of how to think about how to protect intimate privacy, which is you think about, employers, public universities and educators, people, getting money to provide public education from the government. Our people, individuals and entities providing public accommodations, right? They're viewed as the guardians of our ability to travel, right? To stay in hotels, to ride buses, to go to school. They're the guardians of important rights, like our mobility, our ability to work, to get an education. They're the guardians of our civil rights. And as stewards, they have special responsibilities, right? To protect our environments of learning from hostile work environments, from hostile education environments, true of also of the workplace. And you think about the providers of public transportation, that they're the stewards of our opportunities and they have to accommodate and to ensure that everyone can ride a public bus, right? They're the stewards of those opportunities. So in sort of shifting our focus from intimate privacy as we now see it as a consumer protection matter, they're like, all good, collect all you want, do whatever you want with, unless you don't lie to us, right? That model is a failure. That we need to think of intimate privacy as a civil right, right? And that anyone, individuals, companies, governments, handling our intimate information need to treat it with care, that they're the stewards of our intimate data, right? And so that kind of leaves us in a couple places. So like law has failed us, right? Let me explain that companies under the consumer protection model, like it's really only the outliers that we think like abuses of their power, like if you've lied to us in your privacy policy, if you've insecurely, you have massive data breaches, right? It's really at the edges law kind of steps in, often with law enforcers like the Federal Trade Commission and state AGs. We don't have a comprehensive privacy law. We have sectoral laws that are really narrow, like HIPAA does not apply to your health apps. The FTC is trying to be creative about a health data breach notification rule. They have 2 actions, but it's really at the margins. Like, studies have shown that 18 out of the 25 most popular free period tracking and health apps, other fertility apps, are sharing information about people's data with advertisers and marketers as we speak. So law is doing very little to constrain that kind of thing. Sharing and selling of our most information about our bodies, our health, our dating apps, right? That is like consumer protection model is where we live. Very little protection in the United States. And it's also true that when, the sites that Carly were sharing Carly's, like the intimate image of her, the partially naked photo, those sites, thanks to a federal law passed in 1996, can solicit, can encourage, and can keep up intimate privacy violations without any fear of legal liability. So when Carly went there were hundreds of sites that had her nude image. Some had her like home address because her ex had posted it. Their response was either nothing, total silence. One site, basically the site operator said, if you should give me a private show, I'll take it down. Right. And the reason why those sites can just totally ignore people is because they can't be sued by the likes of Carly by victims. They are immune from liability for user-generated content. Now, if we shift the focus from consumer protection and from like no liability land, and if we think about, these websites and companies as the stewards of our intimate data, it changes the default entirely, right? Companies like Grindr can't be collecting, they can't be selling intimate data without a really good reason, and profits is not good enough. As we think about human rights, there are other fundamental freedoms maybe that you can collect and sell and share information for, but it's certainly not good enough unless to sell it with third parties, right? If you're the steward of that information. And Section 230 of the Decency Act, if we lived in a world in which site operators were considered the stewards of our intimate data, then they certainly, the very business of exploiting someone's non-consensual intimate images is just like, wouldn't be a business. There would be liability, right? You're certainly not acting as a steward of that data. And so, we would shift the defaults and how we think about it. And so I've argued in my book that Congress needs to get on the stick. And I realize they may not be. I do a lot of work with staffers on the Hill. We came really close this past summer. The Americans Data Protection Privacy Act had special protections for intimate information, including intimate images. I did some work with staff, and I'm on the board of the Electronic Privacy Information Center. And the bill got out, well, it passed in House Energy and Commerce 52-2. The holdups were California Democrats because they were opposed to the preemption of any state law. And one understands the reason why, but ADPPA was kind of worth the trade-off. It had a private right of action. Nancy Pelosi didn't bring it to the floor. And what is fascinating is that on the Senate side, we had bipartisan support. Wicker, like you had on the Senate Commerce Committee was ready to pass it. So I haven't given up on the project of Congress creating and carving out and thinking about. ADPPA said that privacy was a civil right and had an anti-discrimination provision, which meant that companies couldn't handle people's personal data if it would impact them in ways that would have a particularly pernicious negative impact on vulnerable communities, women and other kinds of vulnerable community, importantly, non-whites, religious minorities, sexual and gender minorities. And it didn't have requirement of proving of, malicious intent. It was like, nope, disparate impact. So we came really close this last summer. So I haven't given up on the possibility of a federal civil right to intimate privacy. But of course, law can't do it all. So often, I've worked a lot with lawmakers thinking about intimate privacy at the state level. When I first started working with the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, on criminalizing intimate privacy violations. There were 3 states in 2014 when Dr. Marianne Franks and I wrote our first article called Criminalizing Revenge Porn. We have worked with state for state with lawmakers, and there are now 48 states, DC and Guam, that have criminal laws on the books. But our journey has only just begun. I just spoke at the White House with Dr. Franks in a convening for the Gender Policy Council. We brought together state lawmakers because as they conceded and as we discussed, we did good, important work, but it's been insufficient to the task. The laws are misdemeanors, so they're woefully under-enforced because nobody wants to bother sort of investigating a misdemeanor, a lot of resources and time. And we also need a lot of education for law enforcement, because so often, as Carly did when she went to law enforcement, their response was like, what did you expect? You knew your access was pretty frightening. You gave them access to your phone. And basically the message was, you know, boys will be boys. It was like really nothing we can do. And as we had at our recent meeting at the White House, state lawmakers explained that, and advocates explained that, so what they hear from their constituents is that law enforcement will say, oh, this other precinct is responsible. And that other precinct, it's like a game of hot potato. That other precinct says like, oh, someone else is responsible. Go to this precinct because that's where the perpetrator lives. And of course, it's like a vicious cycle because it ends up being passed around the case. No one takes a report. And then the victim ultimately feels like, what can be done? So I think if we think about intimate privacy in a comprehensive way as a civil right, it would mean we would have to pass comprehensive laws that viewed not the problems in silos as we think about non-consensual intimate imagery, and we think about, you know, the posting of revenge porn, or we think of video voyeurism, it's all misdemeanors. We would need to see deepfake sex videos. We would need to see it in a comprehensive way and then tackle it comprehensively and with meaningful responses. So we have a lot of work legally to do. Okay. So in the meanwhile, you know, we've got to go to take the case to companies, that is social media companies, search. You know, we're going to have a hard time persuading the 9,500 sites whose business model is not, or, you know, part of it is non-consensual intimate imagery. But, you know, I work with and have long worked with Facebook, or I can't even call it Meta, sorry, Facebook, Instagram, Snap, more recently, Spotify, Bumble, Twitch. I was on Twitter's Trust and Safety Council until Musk fired us all last year, which frankly was quite happy because it was free work we were doing. So, you know, if they're not going to be listened to us, there's kind of no point. But what has been, I think we've seen some meaningful progress from some of the biggest social media companies, which is they've since 2015 banned the posting of non-consensual intimate imagery. They have a problem kind of operationalizing it at scale. We've seen some problems arise, like Twitch just experienced some problems with a gamer showing a deepfake sex video of another gamer. And so Twitch has had me consulting and thinking about how we kind of educate their communities. And we need to pressure companies to educate their users, because operationalizing these things at scale is tough. And we need to bring our case to companies to do better, right, on education. And so, okay, what I thought I would do is, you know, is kind of talk about an example of moral suasion that I think has been really effective, and that we might need to kind of bring our voices to bear in a much more potent way in the United States, because we're kind of the scofflaw. You know, we export a lot of harm because we host a lot of this content and we gather and share and collect permissibly, you know, intimate information. And, you know, I have to say the European approach is not a salve. It's very much very proceduralist approach. And so it's not as if they're doing tons better, but at least they have, you know, the default isn't that you can collect. You need to have one of 6 reasons why you can collect and process intimate information. So at least it's a bit better over in Europe and then in other countries. But I thought I'd talk about the case of South Korea. In 2018, it was really almost impossible for women and girls to go to the bathroom without being recorded, like a public bathroom, without being recorded, secretly recorded. And then, you know, their images, if they're pulling down their pants and going to the bathroom, being uploaded to the cloud. It was so pervasive that women bought what they called Molka kits, which was like little kits that had silicone, so you could fill in little like holes in the public stall if you saw any. They also had like little screwdrivers, so you could break what looked like a hole. It could be a camera, and also masks. This is pre-pandemic, so women would wear and girls would wear masks before going to the bathroom so that they wouldn't be recognized. And at some point, enough was enough. Like they go to law enforcement and, they'd be turned away and basically laughed at. And women and girls and allies started taking to the streets. So there were 5 marches in Seoul in 2018. The first 25,000 people took to the streets. And their signs were both in English and Korean that said, "My life is not your porn." The next march was 3 months later. 50,000 people took to the streets. Again, "My life is not your porn." The third march, I think it was something like approximately 75,000 people took to the streets of Seoul over 2 days. "My life is not your porn." The fourth march, 90,000 people. And the fifth march in December of 2018, 125,000 people took to the streets of Seoul over a weekend, and "My life is not your porn," and all of the posters in Korean and English. Like they wanted to make clear enough was enough. They weren't seeing progress. Government was doing very little. And so the South Korean government created, and they listened to advocates, including myself, but also much more importantly, their own advocates. They called it digital sex crime information because that's what their advocates wanted to call it, which is incredibly important. And they created a commission, which was like a whole of society approach, which was robust criminal, laws, creating laws that would apply to platforms, of course, in their own jurisdiction. They could only address their own jurisdiction, laws that would allow victims to come to the DSEII, the Digital Sex Crime Information Commission, report it. That commission would then tell companies, provide a notice of takedown, and a whole approach in which victims was provided support by government, including resources if they lost their jobs, therapy, like a whole government approach. And since the government has created this commission, there were last year 5,000 victims sought their help. Nearly all of them took advantage of all the services that the government was providing. So if we take to the streets, I always think that moral suasion, we often think like, what does one voice matter? Well, one voice matters when it's a lot of voices all together. So I think, this problem is like, we're often the problem. The South Korean, I was visiting with the commission too, the commissioner and then second in command came to DC in last September, just before my book came out. And we sort of met and talked, and they explained like, oh, it's a lot of good that they do, but so often citizens in their country, their nude images are posted and hosted on sites hosted in the US, and there's nothing they can do. They don't have jurisdiction over those sites. And so like, we need a kind of whole of society approach working on this together. Because all of these sites are global, right? We're a big part of the problem. So I hope that the South Korean example can kind of give us some hope about possibilities. And there's work that we did with companies in 2015 that gave me hope. Most recently, YouTube, Bumble, Spotify, and Reddit have agreed to, following the example of Meta, stuff that I worked on with Meta, was to hash images that have been deemed non-consensual intimate imagery, and then prevent on just those sites, those images from being reposted using Dr. Hani Farid's sort of photo DNA technology. So new developments, interesting self-regulation, not good enough, but I think really worth kind of acknowledging that we're doing something, we're trying at the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, where I'm the vice president. So I need your help. I need your help getting the word out. I need us to work together on this. You're my partners, I know. So I really appreciate it. And I'm excited for I hope there are some comments and questions. It would be great. I know Clara's asked in the chat if there are questions. Otherwise, like she and I and Rob are going to have a conversation.
Yes.
I promised 45 minutes, right, Claire? There you go.
Exactly on the mark. So much, Danielle. That was really interesting conversation, and I had not thought about that level of things happening with privacy. So it's really eye-opening to hear some of those stories. So yeah, thank you for that.
You are welcome. I mean, Claire, one thing I did leave off, is I gestured out kind of government as invader of intimate privacy. And so maybe unless folks ask questions, I can widen the aperture just to show the kind of global part of this story, but also how the US government has been reckless with intimate privacy in ways that I think that is a great affront to all of us. No one's asking questions, so I'm going to do it. Okay.
We
So
do, it looks like
do
we
you have
do
some questions? Okay.
we have a hand raised, so I'm going
Perfect. I don't want to,
allow her
yeah,
to
yeah.
talk.
Let's see.
Tina, I unmuted you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I don't necessarily have a question. It just says that my chat's disabled, so I don't know if other people can actually ask a question. So I thought I'd point that out.
Perfect.
Okay.
So we have to enable the chat, it sounds like.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you so much for letting us know.
Looks like we've just enabled the chat. So thanks so much for pointing that out, Tina.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Yeah, what's the point of saying like, hey, ask us questions, and then the technology spoiled us, which is no surprise to anyone, but like, okay, so it's on now, someone said. So just, one thing to think about, I didn't talk about government kind of violations of intimate privacy, but that, I don't know if you know this, but, Putin rises to power thanks to a manufactured sex tape. We think that deep fake sex videos are like, it's kind of a new thing. So Yeltsin was under investigation for corruption, and the prosecutor, Putin releases a manufactured fake sex video of the prosecutor so that he backs off investigating Yeltsin, and then Yeltsin taps Putin to be the president. So, the question of intimate privacy, intimate compromise, it's a long playbook of authoritarian kind of government actors. And that's true of the Modi regime releasing a deep fake sex video of a really significant, extraordinary, brave human rights journalist, Rana Ayub, to basically get her to be silent. And it worked for about 6 months. She hid in her house. A deep fake sex clip was on like half the phones in India. Unfortunately, President Trump released communications or text messages. His Department of Justice called in the press at night, Department of Justice, to release text message between Pete Strzok and Lisa Page, who were on the Crossfire Hurricane investigation that was investigating the Trump campaign officials' ties to Russia. And the whole idea was to kind of say, CC, the whole investigation was corrupt because their intimate communications, their text messages, they were having a extramarital affair. They used their FBI phones to talk about work, and sometimes they talked about personal things. And the DOJ released those text messages in violation of the Privacy Act to the press. And then Trump seized on those text messages and made both Strzok and Page out to be traitorous lovers. The tweets became a cyber mob storm, rape and death threats, ruination of their careers. Pete has not worked since he was fired from the FBI. He was the country's paramount counterintelligence official. Lisa has since gotten subsequent employment. I talk about both of them in my book. I am their expert witness in their pro bono case against the Department of Justice. But governments are also equal opportunity, intimate privacy violators. Okay, so I'm so glad someone's going to get it for their library. Someone asked, do you have tips for protecting our data on our devices? And this is where I say, my editors ask me from Norton and Penguin for tips, and I include them, though reluctantly, in my book, because we can't fix this ourselves. This is a structural, systemic problem. But okay, I still have tips anyway, right? Which is the first thing is a human tip, which is we got to talk to each other. And when we're in a relationship, we got to talk about trust and confidentiality. We got to set ground rules with each other. That's our kind of first best, if we can help talk to people we care about our expectations of intimate privacy, and teaching young people in our lives about intimate privacy, like we need a cultural shift, and that's like creating the law within us. So we need to do that. But of course, like, I don't know if you have this on your laptop, but you should, in all your devices, like a little thing. I could turn my camera off in 2 seconds. I have a little cute thing I have a camera protector on all of my devices. I love to take pictures. So, but I also have a little sticker that I put on my camera on my phone when I'm not using my phone's easily hacked. I think the hardest part is being able to tell all these apps and all of these companies we're dealing with, unless you live in California, you can't tell them not to sell your data. We have like 5 or 6, 7 comprehensive state privacy laws. Some are so weak as to be written by industry. They're useless, right? The closest we come to anything meaningful is California and Colorado. And even then, if you live in those states, the only thing you can do is just say, please don't sell my data. You can't say don't collect it at scale. So I wish I had like fabulous tips, where I say like, oh, we can fix this ourselves, right? We need to come together to pressure lawmakers too. Okay, so what Liza asks, what in libraries, how can we be mindful when working with users? Like what behaviors should we be modeling? And I think, I have to say that librarians are like our first defenders for our reading habits, right? We know that the American Library Association will go to the mat to protect the reading habits and of folks who come to your libraries. How can you model this kind of thing? I think it's talking about intimate privacy, because your young people who come to your library, they are the ones who are set, their norms are going to be the norms of our next generation, right? And so like teaching them about intimate privacy and why it matters and how we are the guardians for each other, right, is something I think I'd love to see you echo with the folks who come into your library. I know it's hard to talk about nude photos with young people right away, I understand that, but like for older kids, it's something you want to kind of inculcate norms of responsibility and care. Then there's a wonderful question about like, how do we change culture? I mean, we saw it in South Korea, right? So the culture of respect, I hate to say it, but like having, recall that when celebrities' nude photos were hacked, it was called the fappening, happened in 2015. We saw like a moment of reckoning, right? When Jennifer Lawrence, tells Vanity Fair, she felt like the posting of her nude photo, the theft and then posting was like a virtual sexual assault. And we had a moment of reckoning. We're like, we got to do something about it. And it was in that moment that AG, when she was the attorney general, our vice president created a cyber exploitation task force, which I helped her. And what we did at that moment was seize the moment, and she had what she called the power to convene. She brought together 50 companies because she was in Silicon Valley and advocates. And it was then that Google, after meeting, and they sort of figured out this was like bad PR for them. So Google and Bing said that they would de-index people's intimate images and their names, and that continues to this day. So like we have to seize, sadly, some moments where something happens, and we've got to come together with other people and talk about it and like widen the aperture and talk about companies and governments and the importance of intimate privacy. I don't have a precise formula, but if we've seen it in South Korea and we've seen it kind of these moments where people we care about, it happens to, I think that we can create a dynamic of, kind of moments of reckoning like that. We bring it to the public and bring moral suasion to government and to companies. And we could support our organization, the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, which we like operate on a shoestring, advocating and doing work with governments and writing amicus briefs. And we have a victim support line, which is what contributions go to, is to helping our victim support line. Okay, I think I've looked at we have like 3 minutes left or so, but I don't know, Claire, if you've got a question. I don't see any more that I've left unanswered.
Yeah, well, if there are no other questions, We have a couple more comments.
Yeah. I love the idea of a mass opt-out. In fact, in my book, I have, the do not call list, which we operationalize through the FTC and state attorney general's offices, both state, at the federal level. We need a do not collect, right? And that would be part of the congressional agenda that I have in my book. So not unrealistic. Let's do it. At least as I say, as I argue in my book, kind of provide a roadmap. Now there's a paperback edition coming out this summer. So it's not a new edition. The book just came out this past October. So little tweaks, small mistake finding things, but there's a paperback coming out. So cheaper version of it is coming out. Norton, and in the UK, it's Penguin UK, but it's WW Norton in the United States. So it's got a pretty new blue cover. It was pretty yellow and pink with, it's really a cute cover. God bless him. So I hope that and encourage you to pass it on to your readers. And thank you for all that you do. We couldn't be privacy scholars without you. So thank you.
Well, I have one last question. Just when you talked about the law or the bill that you were trying to get to
Yes.
Congress, but it never made it to the floor. Just when you talk
Yeah.
about how it had bipartisan support, it was like, oh, a beacon of hope that something like this could eventually be passed. Is there any way to
It's
know
not dead yet. Like my
Okay.
friends at Epic, I'm on the board of directors of the Electronic Privacy Information Center, the first privacy advocacy group in the country, like devoted to information privacy, started in the mid 90s. Epic tells me it's not a dead letter. That is, we can revive this thing. It still exists as a proposal in the House and the Senate. So the Americans Data Protection Privacy Act it came out of House Energy and Commerce, and someone likes my sweater. I feel like I had to wear it for you. And in the Senate, the Wicker, and I'm forgetting the Democrat who supported it with Wicker. But we can stay on this case. It's not it's not gone forever. It just was so close. I was like, and it had such great provisions around sensitive and intimate data that my friends at Epic made sure were in their negotiations with the bill. Oh, we came so close.
I mean, that's great to hear that it was so close, and just wanting to keep an eye on it in the future so that if we can call our Congress people or whatever to try to voice support for it.
Yes, please.
Is there a way that you can kind of keep up with where it is or
some
place online to stay up to date?
Yeah. Check out the Electronic Privacy Information Center. Has a great website with updates about the bill. I think that's where I would go if I wanted to figure it out. Thank you so much, Tina, putting up Epic's website. Appreciate you.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, looks like we're out of time. So thank you so much, Danielle.
Thank you.
It's been a real pleasure having you. And I know it was like very informative for all of us.
Sorry to freak everybody out. You know what I'm saying? Love you. I always come. I always scare everyone. And I'm sorry, I hate to do it, but I really appreciate your listening and open-mindedness. Really appreciate it.
It's important to know, even though it's scary, it's important to be aware. So thank you.
You bet.
Thank you so
My
much for
honor.
coming.
Oh gosh, my pleasure. Thank you.
Yes. Well,